This is the Little Ice Age. It's written in the rings of a spruce tree, and it sounds like a violin. Jacob woke Mason after midnight. 10 minutes later, they walked out to the old truck, gassed up for the occasion. The dusty fugue relieved by Sophie's botanicals, the wood rose, one of her cash crops, a strain of CBD-rich indica she had been nurturing for years. They drove along the empty street, from the deeply green lakeshore to the firebreak, gouged out of stone and clay 20 years before, and along disintegrating logging roads to the old burns, where Mason could still see char. And as kids they had hiked here to secret rivers and campsites out of cell phone range. Jacob drove in silence, and Mason stared out the window at the ghost forest. Twice they got out to clear the road, and Mason looked up into the low brush. Blackened Douglas fir still towering over the blackberries, recovering plants, growing opportunities emerging from the last wildfire. "Cougars?" he asked. "Yeah, a lot of them lately. They follow the deer. It's good news, but makes working nights a bit more exciting." He thought he spotted its silhouette in the darkness. Above them wandered what it saw, in turn, competitors or prey in disorienting headlights. The eagles had come back, nesting in the ghost trees. So had the black-tailed deer and robins. The microclimates had changed as the forests began their slow return, though. A prefigure of what the coast would be in hundreds of years. Arbutus further inland, outside its original ranges. Jerry Oak farther west and north as the coast dried out. In 1,000 years, it would be another sort of forest, if it was still there. In 2 hours, they made it to the edge of the surviving rainforest. On the west coast of the island's mountains, they dodged the wildfires that destroyed most of everything in the last 20 years. 20 minutes on a rutted track, until they pulled over and met a guy, silent, nodding to Jacob as he climbed into the cab, directing them to an even narrower dirt track. "That's Chris," Jacob said. They weren't far from the tree, which stood in what was still a provincial bark. Technically, though, the trails were rarely maintained, and what boot prints he could see were probably other poachers. This was the largest surviving Sitka spruce in the world, and maybe people still wanted to see it, even if the busloads of school kids were rare, and the marine biology stations at Bamfield had been shuttered for years. 3 more men waiting, a few gestures indicating the direction they'd drop it. This time it would take. Mason and Chris hung back, watching the wiry old faller put on his helmet, his chainsaw behind him, and they waited for the breeze to be still. There was a kind of quiet he had never felt in Vancouver, even now, when it was marred by shuffling men, or cougars, and then the chainsaw flooded them, and he heard nothing but its whine, as it cut through the trunk, kindred to the kind that grew in Lafime, the Valley of Song in the Italian Alps. It was rumored a skilled lumberman could hear a violin hiding in the trunks. He'd heard there might be an ancient Sitka, Kitimat, but that was too far to travel, even for something as precious as an old-grown tonewood. This, though, he remembered visiting as a kid. It sized the unlikely fact of its survival after 2 centuries of logging and wildfires. Didn't take that long. A deep cut on either side of directions of one of the other available roads, where a big truck probably waited. Then the wedges. The high, sweet note of the hammer, waiting, until something inside it tore, and it fell, bounced, and thrashed branches like tendrilled ocean creatures or waves, like hair, like a body in spasm. Then it was still, and silence held for a long moment. Mason and Critch watched all the wiry, furtive men. From where? Port Alberni? Or maybe one of the transient camps to which resource officers and RCMP turned temporary blind eyes because even they weren't jerks enough to burn down a 5-year-old camp. "Deal with the stump," Jacob said. Mason and Chris didn't know what he meant. "Stump. Cover it over. Whatever you can find on the ground." "Is that really a problem? We're pretty deep in." "They'll still send drones through." Why would they even... Anyway, I'll get you when it's time. Behind him, the stump was brightly pale in the darkness, sweet and resinous, and he dropped branches over 3 meters of open wound, admiring the heartwood, which was surprisingly free of infestation, whether beetle or fungus. And behind him, the tree grew steadily simpler, its branches tossed away, its trunk straight and handsome, and more than 400 years old, and a baby compared to the ancient one, the bristlecone, or the one big one in Norway. But what could a bristlecore sound like? Sitka spruce, though, had heard often and loved. He'd get to Cremona and apprentice to Aldo because Eddie knew him. He could write an open letter. He'd visit the Valley of Song and see what survived of the European spruce. He could tell the master luthiers the story of poaching old growth in a provincial park. This would laugh and clap and back on. Dragged away from his plans for Cremona, and back to the immediate problem of sourcing old growth for a perfect violin, he saw that the tired, sweaty man had begun stripping their gear in the darkness, lit by phones and helmets. He didn't actually know what he was looking for, but he worked his way down the long, straight section nearest the base. "This is Jake." The group hushed. "This is it. This is the one." And the other guys melted into the darkness. It was close to daylight by then, and all the while the forest floor was still dark. Mason could see the sky from time to time, and Jake squatted by the section. "You're sure? You're really sure this is the one?" "Yes, I am sure." It took them 2 hours to get it to the truck, then another 3 to get it home. What'll happen to the rest of it? Firewood went for $1,000 a cord last winter. The tree could keep a lot of people warm. There's pulp still. Mills would buy it up without asking too many questions. You don't get the same kind of cash, but it's safer, less work. Behind them, the quarter of old men spruce remained silent, except for the truth created a resistance in the enormous weight. There are luthiers around the world who'll kill for that. At least in a few years. Sure. Or it could heat someone's house this entire winter. I'm gonna grab a swim, then get to work in the greenhouse. Mason knew he would help, but he found himself following the old route along the house to the bedroom he still thought of as his, the dark kitchen past the bunches of garlic, the bookshelves in the living room piled with National Geographics from the 20th century, past the windowsills that still held Grandma's things, beach glass and thunder eggs, feathers, stained glass that caught no light of a window shrouded by brush, and he lay in the cool, stale room where the carpet had been discolored by water seeping through the wall 40 years before. It smelled like being 10, like summer, like the thousands of nights his family had passed through the wood-paneled walls, the narrow window facing south toward the lake. Sophie called it, keeping in with her friends in the local band, out of which they had all starred, and wondered what would happen next. During the Little Ice Age, the global temperature dropped to 1 degree Celsius on average. There were debates regarding the cause of these apparent winters. At least one trigger had been the mass death of people in the North and South America, which 90% of the population, by some estimates, died. Lost languages and cities, toddlers and great-grandmothers, handsome young men and dreaming girls, villages and trade routes and favorite jokes. After so many deaths, an area of agricultural land the size of France returned to the forest, and the regreening sequestered enough carbon from the pre-industrial atmosphere that temperatures took centuries to recover and begin their steady rise to the present day. The wild and empty continent of later explorers was in part a sepulchre, a monument inscribed with languages that they could not speak, full of witnesses that was a terrible loss. And from the cold and darkness of 100 million years to the chilly woodsmen of the Valley of Song, the Pagini playing of Il Con Garnias is a long and terrible history. At Katsa, the disaster is slow despite temporary changes in climate, because the smallpox that will ravage the coast had not yet arrived. People go about their business on the water and in the forest. And from the Pacific coast to the saltish sea, children are born. Songs are composed. Nurse logs disintegrates. And the little spruce, rooted there, rises toward the light. Its heartwood formed in an apocalypse. In addition, Jake and Sophie grew THC-rich sativa, which Mason disliked because it made him paranoid, but which sold steadily as far as Seattle, and kept, in Jake's words, the homestead together. Sophie's raised it hydronically in Grandpa's old workshop. Later in the afternoon, Mason visited the place under a tarp in a corner of the workshop. Mason had been greedy, and there was material for 24 violins, assuming he found within it the biddle he needed. And he tried to remember what Eddie had done the last time they toured the mills for legal maple, willow, and spruce. Eddie could hear a violin and a slab of big leaf maple. He could hear Willow's sonic geometry as he tested its spring with his hands. If Eddie were here, the quarter would speak. He was still listening when Sophie shouldered through the grass, watering in hand. "There are 2 more, she said, gesturing toward the door, and he grabbed them, warm with sunlight. Together they watered the market. Potatoes, tomatoes, chili peppers, and mint. And Mason took cannabis oil away every visit, dropping onto his tongue an resinous burn, applying the ointment to his right wrist, where the tendons ached, more effective than anything he could afford legally. Hey, you ever going legit? Hasn't happened to me by now, I doubt it ever will. I applied again last year, but never heard anything. Jacob, you got what you needed?" And Mason nodded. The tree crashed again to his mind. "He's helping someone cut firewood. He said you should sleep while you can. How long do you think we sit on it anyway? It's got to be a season. Decade probably, ideally a century, but, you know." And she nodded, then led him through the hydroponics to a tiny room full of geranium slips and tomatoes. "Lots to do, Mason. Keep watering." In the 3rd decade of the 21st century, a girl born in Surrey Memorial Hospital, the labor is 6 hours, and the child is magnetically named Masami Lucretia Delgado. She has a tiny, pointed finger and strong hands that are precise in their movements, as though waiting for the fingerboard of a violin, even in the moment of her birth. And when she's 3 years old, an ad interrupts her cartoon, and she waits first in irritation, then in fascination, jabbing at the corner of the screen where the skip button should appear. But it didn't. Instead of a cartoon cloud who sings about rainbows and unicorns, she watched an ad for life insurance that featured a little girl so like Masami. She seems to be a mirror, a twin, with bright black hair and curious brown eyes. This little girl, the other Masami, holds a violin to her chin and plays something that makes Masami's heart rise in her chest, a white cloud drifting higher and higher among the rainbows. Masami is too small to name what she hears. Though it marks her forever, she soon forgets the first encounter with destiny. Something of it must remain with her, however, because a year later she hears the sound of a violin and asks her mother, "What was that?" Now she's 4, and her father shows her violin videos, and outside the air is opaque with smoke from the fire of the North Shore, which systematically destroys the huge houses overlooking Bernard Inlet. The pipeline that terminated in Burnaby is cracked again, somewhere up country, who knows where, and spilled 2,000 barrels of diluted bitumen into the lake. The Masami is too small to understand, and when she hears the sound of Marguerite Fell playing the ex-Congiaco violin from a quartet made of Gangiani in Milan in 1780, she's transported. And some portion of her soul will never return from that transport. Her future is in that moment fixed. Her tiny hands will grow into her violin, and the instrument less an exterior object than an extension of her body. She's neurologically, emotionally, and psychologically part violin. It's in her heart, and her muscle memory. And by the time she's 14, she'll have obtained tunnel syndrome and need regular physio to deal with nerves and compression. Her body has grown up around the violin, the way a tree grows around a nurse log. Masami Delgado was the reason Mason poached the last of the ancient Sitka spruces. But it wasn't her fault. Actually, maybe Eddie started off with one of those offhand comments. Shuffling through the workshop in old jeans, pockets sagging with pencils and calipers, a finger plane, he stopped at Mason's bench, where Mason was mending a violin, and they got cheap from someone in town. He was still surprised to find Eddie trusted him to touch the instruments. For a long time, he just swept the shop floor, drove the van, tended the glue pot, and he still did those things, but he also got to replace a split tuning peg on a student violin, and it felt good to hold it in his hands, feeling the thin shell of its body, saying to it, "Come on, little guy, let's get you sorted." "Hey, you know it's never gonna sound the same, right?" Eddie said. And he listened to the long bow draw. "Yeah, it's not great, but it's solid for a student No," Eddie said, in an abrupt way that almost made Mason fall over. "No, can't be a student violin, it's the wood." And he ran his finger down the bright spruce fade. "This is pretty young stuff. More carbon in the atmosphere changed the density of the wood. We're never going to see the same kind of growth again, even in the forest recovery. You need to drop the G." Mason listened, and Eddie was right. "We're going to go check out the saddle," he said during intermission. "Why?" Eddie shrugged, and the lights dimmed again. Backstage, Delgado's parents hovered. Mason, still disoriented by the evening performance, couldn't speak. "May I?" Eddie said, and she nodded, and her eyes never left the violin. "You've had it for 3 years?" And she nodded. "And then that's it?" And her mother answered, "You don't get it twice." It hurt him that something that fit so perfectly on her shoulder should be lost. She should have it for the rest of her life, at international tours and recording studios. It should be by hers, some right of genius. I wish you could have it forever." But then Eddie was finished, and her parents were shepherding her away, and he realized he hadn't heard the voice not once. And as they waited for an Uber, Eddie said, "It's not going to last." Wildfires were burning on the North Shore, and the sunset was an angry smudge, and Mason knew, and the sounds of the old growth leaving the world. "What do we do?" "Nothing we can do. The saddle's been wearing noticeably for decades now. Could be a split forming, though I didn't see anything on the last scan. Maybe it'll show in the next 20 years, or maybe it'll be longer than that, I don't know. We can't replace it? I mean, we can, but we won't. They aren't immortal. Eventually it will be playable. Then it'll just go to sleep." That night, Mason walked down to Granville Street past the shuttered theaters that had once been full of music. He circled back to Hastings and walked out towards his little room in a building on Gore, where the rent was almost decent. Then he searched through Eddie's database and found the transcendental geometries of the violin player, emissary of the 17th century, where the workshops of Cremonia luthiers made instruments so perfectly they seemed to not have been built but grown. Alien sea cells, the sea pods of strange flowers. He had touched one today, felt its lightness against his palm, patented by centuries of sweat, the oil of many hands and faces, rich with life, and all that alchemy of trees and climate, genius and history. She would have had it for 3 years, and then the saddle would split, and it would be lost forever. That was the day he formed the plan. A violin made as purely and patiently as he could manage, following the guidance of a long-dead luthier, passed down to him through Eddie, and when it was finished, he would go to the Po Valley and join the Scuola Internazionale de Lutteri Cremona, where he would tell a dozen old Italian masters the story of his accomplishment. But the material he'd need weren't just expensive, they were non-existent. Trees at the 500 ppm present wouldn't do. He needed old growth, with heartwood grown in the last climate. "Everything I can afford," he told Eddie the next day. "Everything I can afford is ugly." Unspoken, too ugly for Delgado, who deserves more than the world could offer her these days. "It's not ugly, it's just different." He picked up the violin Mason had assembled from salvage materials, and Eddie had discarded. And before disappearing up the stairs and into the shop, returning with the fiddle Mason had often looked at. "Some guys, he made it out of this pose from a longhouse like 150 years ago. If he can do that, you can figure something out." The longhouse stood a long village way down the southeast Marine Drive. The violin had a cedar front, a maple neck and back. Eddie insisted it had come from a stack of firewood. He'd had some dechronologists look at it, dating the wood to the 1700s. Maybe some fiddler lost in the crossing or gambled it all away like a song. But he'd landed on the edge of nowhere and built something new from what he found. Not well built by many rules. Sounds of drowsy, deep, Mason could hear just blowing in the strings. And he wondered what it would sound like in Delgado's hands. Something by Sarust, a Bach violin concerto. Or maybe it would be a dance number, played in a small room in front of the rain fell outside. Maybe he thought it would be earlier sounds from an equally rainy night. Longhouse on the south slope toward the river, a rainy hillside that had not yet thought becoming Vancouver. Voices, laughter, a language he did not know, and a moment captured in the reverberating matrices of the wood itself. For a few years after the fall, he made nothing new. He just ran the shop and stirred the glue pot, made sure that Eddie took his meds and saw the doctor. But as his arm recovered, sort of, and he no longer dreamed of falling, he could stand to look at the willow again. He could even look at the old Jack Daniels box in a corner of the storage room which held the violin and its constituent parts. You could make it for a kindling if you didn't know. It still took him 3 years to open the box and begin work on the forms, slowly because his left shoulder remained weak, and sometimes his left hand just failed. For an hour sometimes in the evenings, he worked ribs and blocks of willow in the basement workshop at night, where he often stayed on a cot in case Eddie needed help. It took another 5 years of austerity to pay back black market prices for Gaboon's ebony from Nigeria, and the whole time worrying the trees would all be dead before he could save the money. And in the end, the wood he needed for the fingerboard tailpiece and saddle cleaned out what was left of this Cremona account. But he saved money on the tuning pegs, which were boxwood poached from Queen Elizabeth Park and stained fine black. But then, Mason had moved into the shop, temporarily, they said, to keep an eye on Eddie. Because he'd gotten old. He'd always been old. 50 when Mason joined the firm at 22, but not old. Now he shuffled around the workshop, skinnier every year, and pretty soon he stood going down to the basement because of the stairs. So Mason set his workbench up in what had been a dining room. Eddie could still watch the till, but he hardly spoke to customers, and he was happiest at the bench and the dressing gown, working on some delicate job, listening to the grubby speakers that sat on the kitchen counter. And once in a while, they were having coffee. Eddie reached across the table for a spoon, and his wrist emerged from the ragged cuff of his hoodie. Mason was transfixed by how thin it was. How thin. The spot, the careful way he picked up the spoon, as though every action required some sort of calculation. "Man, what are you now, 70? He said without thinking. "I'm 76. Oh, that means I must be. Wow. Yeah, exactly." That January, he began shaping big leaf maple from an antique dresser into the violin neck. A king tide rolled over the flats by the hospital and the science center. We started to talk about a sea gate at the mouth of False Creek, though debate continued about how much of the original coastline should be preserved. The old beach is flooded now, water creeping up over the grass below the planetarium. And once Mason saw a river otter slip across a concrete path and into False Creek, the river otter seemed untroubled by his new home, just like the seagulls or the ducks. He went back to the shop to tell Eddie about the first finger of floodwater flooding across Main Street. 50-centimeter rise is predicted, then another half-meter from king tide. Here we were, in the future, watching mussels grow out of the bases of pillars that had once held shades over the park benches of wealthy Yaletown residents. He wanted to say to the walls that had once contained False Creek, "Turn it back." And he got home to find Eddie, listening. The Bach exercises on the bourbon viola. Mason stowed the bills from the basement workshop. He could hear Melchior upstairs while he did it, louder than Eddie usually did, so some of the low notes rattled to the door of the workshop. And up the stairs, still full of that floodwater engulfing Main Street, he stopped in the doorway, about to spill his news, and said, "Hey, what's wrong?" Wildfires in Poe Valley. Burning farms and groves left dry by 5-year drought. Cremona engulfed, and at least 1,000 people dead. The Museo de Violino lost. And Pieta, a portrait of Saint Sebastian from a small town, an altarpiece and a collection of fine instruments stored in Torino. No more Cremona. I should have asked Aldo. I wish. Eddie said in a torn voice of a night spent coughing in the lumpy old futon chair in the corner of his room, which bore the dark marks of his hand where he had been resting them for 40 years. I wish I'd enjoyed it all more. I mean, sure, I should have done more to change things. Been a proper revolutionary, or whatever. But actually, I just wish I'd spent less time thinking about it. And really good coffee and drinking it in a good shop, but knowing I could get on an airplane at any time, go to Cremona, Aldo, just to see him, don't think I enjoyed it enough. Now it's too late. It's not too late. No more elephants. No more trees. No more Cremona. No more Aldo. And he thought of the silence after the chainsaw. The minueted at the spruce fell. Cougars moving soundlessly in the tinderbox wood around them. And he thought of the storm of its branches hitting the ground, and the way it shuddered under his feet, and how he had found it, the core pieces, the hardwood of his violin, which had been alive in the 17th century, and which had waited on a hillside until now. First Eddie laughed, and then he coughed. Mason thumped the old man's back with his good arm. It's not too late. He couldn't explain it, because they had arranged a silence regarding the violin, and the thing he did to build it. He couldn't explain. But it wasn't too late, because under a tarp in a shed, in that bit of land between the lake and the ghost forest, the spruce had been seasoning for 15 years. In a box under his workbench, he had black market Gaboon ebony for the fingerboard, one of the last shipments smuggled out of Nigeria. Fine poured, dense, deeply black ebony. He had glued, made from the skin of rabbits. He he had trapped at night, and he had carved a geometrically perfect scroll of its neck from a place 200 years old. And soon he would bring them together into something miraculous. But it must happen soon. Looking down at the old man, his lips, chin slick with spectrum, coughed up in the last paroxysm. "You look like your dad," was the first thing Jacob said that night when he reached the house by the lake. Slack-jawed and greasy-haired. Once the day trip had measured hours, he could be back in a day. It had been 15 years since his last visit. His shoulder obsessed. "I imagine you know that. Do you still have a doctor?" He had no longer had a doctor. The guy at the clinic helped sometimes. "Yeah, there's nothing to do except surgery." And then the heavy skunk overtook the ache, a scent that reminded him of his grandmother's garden on a hot day, penetrating the astringent beneath the peppermint and lemon balm. It smells like, he said in a voice that seemed to come from far away, but he couldn't tell them exactly what it smelled like. Like home, maybe. Then they helped him to the old back bedroom. He didn't remember anything about that. And when he woke shortly before noon, Sophie was gone, but Jake was there on the porch outside the kitchen, drinking something sort of like coffee made out of toasted barley. She's been working in the forestry lab. Someone she knew in undergrad got hold of her. They've been working together. Genetic mods, fast-growing, carbon sinks, drought-resistant. It's looking pretty promising. It's the first good news Mason had heard in a long time. Together they walked up to the garden she'd been pulling on old house sites. The street still showed a trace of tarmac, if he kept his eyes fixed on the yellow street paint. If he looked between his feet and listened to Jacob talk and felt the lake breeze, the town could be as it was when he was a kid. Maybe his mother lived here before the fires, or before that, when the grandparents built this homestead at the edge of nowhere. Kids played at the lake, and then kids still played in the lake. The Sikh kids returned to Paldi, and the village grew up around the temple again. Kids climbed around the alders and grew in the path of old fires, picking blackberries rich with the heat of new worlds. Kids fishing, weeding garden pilots, where the houses had been demolished, and kids singing songs he didn't recognize. Jacob was limping slightly now. They stopped when they saw Sophie in the middle of the garden near the water, her hair a frizz of gray in the sunlight, and a couple of boys and girls nearby, her arms full of green. Rajdir brought some Jersey cows from up island. They like carrot tops to eat, and it's our turn to get a couple of liters. The putters they're amazing. And that evening they ate a soft farmer's cheese, and she talked about the trees, the plantation of the old town site, about more plans, a gang of kids replanting the burned out subdivisions of 20 years before. And you couldn't see the old roads in some places, she said. It's like they're gone. Where? Everywhere. It's regreening. We lost, 90% of our population to the mainland? So why not give it all back? Some to the kids? Give it a couple 100 years and maybe we'll make violins from the trees we're planting now. He didn't want to say it, but her newly willed world, without roads, without houses, filled him with a terrible bitterness he could not describe. Yeah, they won't sound the same. Nope, Jacob said. Not at all the same. That night he lay in a long time in a half-sleep of pain and painkillers, his shoulder numb from Sophie's ministration that evening. He could not escape the crash of the old Sitka spruce hitting the ground, and the crunch of 500 years of upward growth finally giving in, finally to gravity. And he wondered if he would still be standing if he had mentioned it to Jake 15 years ago, in the middle of the night, when he was going to demolition sites looking for old spruce, wild with ambition for Delgado, who would play Moscow, Barcelona, and Singapore. And Jake had asked where it was. Did he remember how to get there? How to find it on a map? Mason did remember. And said, I'd like to be there. I'd like to listen. And a couple of months later, Jake had mentioned it again. Here we are, he thought, his shoulder throbbing dully on the other side. That day, Mason returned to the island. Eddie woke up just before midnight, but it was still hot and airless. I gotta go in, he said. Where? Mason asked stupidly, then realized what Eddie meant, found his shoes and helped the old man down to the curb, where they waited for an Uber, and then waited at the hospital for 7 hours. Eddie silent, breathing roughly in, raggedly out again, while other patients paced, sometimes shouted, and a phosphorescence tube above their heads flickered and hissed. They kept him for a couple days. Mason visited with things from home, a tablet, a sweater, newly refurbished violins for inspection. He was shrunken, a cranky man, complaining to the nurse in a small, petulant voice. It was hot. Could they do something about it? The heat. Mason sat with him for a while he ate, then walked an hour back to the shop, where he had set up a bed in the basement. Nearly cool room that smelled of wood shavings and resin and glue, which was comforting for a while. On the other side of the peninsula, Eddie struggled with each breath in turn, and here it was almost quiet. Just Mason, the remaining problem, the sound post. Properly speaking, it should be made of spruce, like the front. But he wanted something he had seasoned longer than 15 years. Something precious to hide away. Something only he would know about. There was the old fiddle. The one that some frontiersman made out of wood salvaged from the skids that once ran through Gastown and the beams of Longhouse. Once shortly after he met her, Delgado came into the shop for an order of strings that Eddie brought in. She played Where Does the River Run? And he had a laugh, and asked her to play again, anything, to wake the violin up and keep it alive a little longer. She had played at length, and wild with generosity, sweet old waltzes. Humming, he climbed the stairs, and he let himself into the shop and opened the display case that held the old fiddle. It was another crime. Nevertheless, he carried it downstairs to his bench. He did not want to think too much, so he worked quickly, pulling the old sound post and adding a new one, returning the violin to the store's display case. Downstairs, the old bit of dowel was rough against his fingers. Cedar, maybe, from the same post in the longhouse on the Fraser, light and ancient and marked by the original luthier Ralph knife. Flagrant, when he was warmed with his hands, but no potent aromatics, just deep, redolent dust. Then he fitted it. It hid so perfectly in his violin. Maybe no one would know the terrible thing he had done. The secret history he had stolen, like all the other secret histories that constituted his violin. He knew, though, all the courses that material took, from Nigeria, from the islands, from demolished bungalows in East Van, from vacant lot rabbits, and from Stanley Park. Even from his bed, even on oxygen, Eddie was critical when Mason brought it upstairs, examining it with eyeglasses until conceded that its sound was fine in its own way, as any number of other violins had seen. Finer even than the composites he started to use for his own work. Well, you made something, kid. Does it have a name? Does it need one? I don't know, how about the Vancouver violin? Yeah, better than that, kid. And Eddie wouldn't play it, and neither would Mason. Delgado was swamped at the center, had a toddler, so while the violin Spruce Goose was finished in September, he didn't hear it until the new year. She was late, but that was okay. The toddler was with her, just slightly disturbing. And Mason figured they could keep her away from the detritus of the apartment, which is mostly a workshop, and then there were little cookies, at least for it feed, at the back of the kitchen cupboard. I meant to leave her at home, but Johnny got a last-minute shift. No worries, Eddie said, quietly. We're just happy to see you. Is this it? Mason's throat was unaccountably closed, so he just Delgado juggled Celinda from one arm to the other. Oh. Mommy, Belinda murmured, sleepy. I'm going to put you down for a sec, baby. She rubbed her hands on her jeans, and Belinda now squatting at her feet, leaning on her knees. Oh. He thought he saw a tremor. Her face dropped into a neck, so her head fell forward and locked. Then, the bow, drawn across the open E, and he heard it, sweetly and deep, with brightly clear reverberation. Delgado made a wild little laugh and ran a scale, another scale, then interlocking arpeggios. And by her feet, Belinda spoke to a little blue bear, patting her threadbare ears. Delgado dropped the violin from her neck, cradled it. Her eyes were bright, as though with tears, but her voice was warm. It's so... Mason. Will you play something? She played Beethoven, the Kreutzer Sonata, as though she remembered the night they had struck forever in Mason's heart. The chant center, the violin, and Delgado. And Eddie leaned to the left side of the wheelchair, his eyes closed, the oxygen tank hissing faintly, and the sound of people at the window. And Belinda's murmur, bear. All these interruptions should be maddening, but they were not. They only seemed to complement the room's fragile magic. How long have you worked on this? A while, Mason said, and saw her as she had been. 15 and brilliant, with an actual future stretching all the way to Paris. He had imagined hearing it for the first time in some acoustically perfect opera house, because the world would have recovered by then. And he knew it was foolish, but it hurt to think Delgado would never carry it away from his provincial little corner. What will you do with it now? Who's going to play it? It was strange to him that she needed to ask. Oh, no. Belinda looked up from the bear. Mommy? You can use it in your classroom, can't you? I think it'll age okay. It'll open up. She didn't respond for a few minutes. Crouched down to where Belinda sat with the bear, her brow furrowed with worry for her mother. Then she stood and asked, Does it have a name? See, it should have a name, Eddie said. Mason heard the oceanic crash of falling spruce. His own cry as he hit the dirt at the base of a shining willow in Stanley Park, the market garden and the homestead, the abandoned subdivisions, the burned lines that still showed through the underbrush, the ghost forest, and among them, Jacob still cutting lumber and helping out at the garage where he could find, fishing and hunting, Sophie in the greenhouses and the gardens, and with her new Gary oak tree and her transfigured arbutus, the beetle-resistant spruce that would never ever be the kind of tonewood he wanted, and the fire breaks of trembling aspen, the cougars, the steady erosion of human shapes, foundations and roads, all the lost burgeoning forest. Remember, you're going to come back here for good. It's still home. And he just nodded, with the ache of disappointment that had accompanied him for decades now, but a tiny exhausted part of him almost liked imagining it, how he'd go back to work in the garden, raising saplings for the new forest that now overtook the old world, and watching kids disappear into the wild. Me will be someone 100 years in the future, who lives in a different world than we do, pick up the instrument, draw her bow across the string, releasing the reverberations of 1,000 crimes and accidents into the singing air.